The last time John McAllister held someone in his arms, it was his dying son in a burning house. The next time would be a stranger, half alive, beneath a mesquite tree. John didn't speak much these days. Not because he couldn't, but because there wasn't anyone left worth speaking to. Words had become like old tools, still there, still sharp, but long untouched. Silence had crept into his life not as a punishment, but as a companion. And the land, vast and unforgiving, asked no questions. His ranch, nestled against the jagged edge of the Arizona Canyon, had no use for talk. The land responded to sweat, not sentences. Fences needed mending. Horses needed feeding. Coyotes needed discouraging. There was rhythm here, not joy, not peace, but rhythm. It had been 12 years since the fire. He still remembered the way the smoke didn't smell like wood at first, more like fabric and hair. He still remembered the sound of his boy's voice, sharp and high and full of confusion. He still remembered the way his wife's hand slipped from his as the roof gave in. And the smell, he couldn't scrub that from his skin no matter how many times he'd tried. Some nights he still woke up with his hands clenched, as if still carrying their weight. But there was no one in them now. The porch creaked as he stepped out into the late afternoon sun, coffee in one hand, rifle in the other. He set the cup down beside the worn rocking chair and gazed out over the endless horizon. The sky bled into the desert with that coppery light only Arizona could pull off. Wind stirred the dust like memory, and memory was the one thing John never could keep buried. There was an old photo frame on the mantel, face down. He hadn't turned it upright in over a decade. Letting it lie like that didn't feel like forgetting, more like surrendering to the truth. He sipped the coffee, strong, bitter, just the way he liked it, the way she used to make it before the mornings stopped mattering. Out in the corral, the mare snorted and kicked at the gate. The horses were restless, more so than usual. John set the cup down, adjusted the rifle strap, and walked across the yard, boots stirring up little clouds of red dust. He checked the fence line out of habit more than necessity, but something about the wind today, it carried a different note, thinner, sharper. Birds weren't singing. John paused beside the southern fence, hand on the rough wood post, eyes narrowed against the setting sun. The heat shimmered off the rocks in waves, turning the world into a watercolor of red and gold. But beyond that, there was movement. Not close, just the kind your instincts catch before your mind does. He scanned the brush, but saw nothing out of place. Yet the feeling clung to him, like how a storm announces itself with silence before thunder. He ran his fingers down the worn leather strap of his rifle, just in case. The mare pawed the ground again. That's when he heard it. A sound so faint it could have been wind, except wind didn't tremble. John froze. Then it came again, soft, cracked, barely more than breath. A voice. Not a word, not a call, a whimper. It came from just beyond the ridge, near the grove of mesquite trees. He didn't move at first, just stood there, listening. Then he turned, deliberate, quiet, and walked toward it. He wasn't expecting a person. Coyotes, maybe? A deer caught in wire. But not this. Not someone. Not again. John moved with practiced silence. The path down the ridge was narrow, littered with loose stone and dry twigs. He stepped carefully, the butt of his rifle brushing against his back as he ducked beneath the brittle arms of an overgrown juniper. The whimper came again, closer now. It wasn't an animal. It had shape, human, raw. He rounded the last bend and saw her. She lay crumpled beneath a twisted mesquite tree, one leg curled unnaturally beneath her. Her skin was streaked with dust and dried blood, her long dark hair matted with twigs and burrs.
Her dress, torn and sun-bleached, clung to her frame like the last thing she had left. John stopped. Not because he didn't know what to do, but because something inside him recoiled, not at her, but at what she represented. Someone else to carry. Her eyes opened, big, black, wild, and afraid. They locked onto him, and for a moment the desert held its breath. The wind, the birds, the sound of the earth, all paused. Just the two of them. The man with dust on his boots and grief in his bones, and the girl who looked like the land itself had spit her out. He held out his hand slowly. "No gun," he said. His voice was rough, unused. "Just me." She didn't move. He stepped closer, crouched a few feet away.
The heat radiating from the sand seeped through his knees. He took out his canteen and uncapped it. "Thirsty?" She blinked once, then again. Her lips were cracked, bleeding. She looked at the water like it was a memory she didn't trust. He offered it anyway. After a pause, she reached out, trembling. She took the canteen with both hands and drank in small, desperate sips. John watched the way her throat worked, the way her fingers shook. "You alone out here?" he asked. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her breath rasped, and her body swayed slightly before she steadied herself with one hand in the dust. He saw the ankle then, swollen, red, wrong. "You can't walk on that," he murmured. She didn't answer. He looked back the way he came. The sun was dipping fast, turning the canyon wall behind them to flame. Night would come swift and cold. Coyotes would come with it. He didn't ask who she was, didn't ask where she came from. Those were tomorrow's questions. Right now, she was hurt, and the desert didn't forgive the weak. He slid his arms beneath her, gently, slowly, like handling something sacred. She didn't resist, just winced and gripped his shirt with surprising strength. She weighed less than he expected. Her bones felt like they belonged to someone who hadn't eaten properly in days. John stood, cradling her against his chest. Her head rested against his collarbone, and her breath came shallow and fast. Her skin was hot from fever or sun or both. He turned toward the ridge. The walk back felt longer, the climb harder. His body remembered how to bear weight, but his heart didn't, not since that night. As he reached the top, he paused for breath. The sky behind him bled pink and orange, and the ranch sat quiet in the distance, bathed in gold. The porch, the barn, the half-fixed fence. All of it waiting, all of it still. He looked down at the girl in his arms. She had passed out. Her face, in rest, seemed younger, or maybe just more lost. Something stirred in him again, small like an ember, dangerous. He exhaled long and slow. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 34:18. He kept walking. Your thoughts truly matter. Don't hesitate to give this story a rating. Elena didn't speak for 2 days. John didn't expect her to. She moved like someone used to surviving, not living. Her steps were light but measured, her eyes always scanning, as if danger still lingered just behind the barn. She didn't explore beyond the front porch, didn't ask where she was, didn't thank him. But she didn't need to. Gratitude came in the way she folded the blanket neatly each morning, in how she wiped down the tin plate after meals, in how she never touched what wasn't hers. John watched from a distance. She slept on the couch, propped up by a spare saddlebag and an old wool quilt that still carried the scent of cedar. She limped to the water barrel by herself. Twice he saw her try to boil something in a pot over the stove, some crushed pods and herbs she must have gathered from the edge of the canyon before her ankle had fully given out again. He said nothing, just made sure there was always wood beside the stove. At night, they shared the silence. He sat on the porch in his old chair.
She remained inside by the window, the glow of the lantern outlining her in shadows. Neither of them needed sound, not yet. John had known many types of silence in his life. The awkward hush between soldiers before the first shot, the reverent silence of prayer at a graveside, the bitter silence that came after a child stopped crying. But this was different. This was the silence of two people carrying too much noise inside to let any of it out. On the third morning, she winced when putting weight on her ankle. John was fixing a cracked hinge on the barn door and saw her stumble. He didn't call out, just walked inside, filled a basin with warm water, tore a clean strip of cloth from an old shirt, and waited. She sat without protest when he knelt before her. He dipped the cloth and gently began to rewrap the swelling. Her voice was dry but clear. "You were a soldier?" It was the first thing she'd said to him. John didn't look up. "A long time ago." "North or south?" He glanced at her, half a smile in one corner of his mouth. "Let's just say I fought for the ones who had less." She didn't ask more. He finished the wrap and stood, leaving the basin beside her. She dipped her fingers in and let the heat seep into her hands. There were fresh scars across her knuckles, old burns on her wrist, signs of work or escape. That afternoon, he found her sitting outside, face tilted toward the sun, like someone trying to remember what warmth felt like.
He didn't interrupt, just sat in his chair and picked up his carving knife, shaving down a splintered fence post. A hawk circled overhead. The wind carried the scent of dust and juniper. The day passed like that, quiet and steady. Inside, after supper, she lingered by the window. John watched her silhouette. There was something familiar in the way she stood, like his wife used to when watching their boy play in the dirt. Before turning in, John did something he hadn't done in years. He walked to the fireplace and turned over the photo frame lying face down on the mantel. His wife and son looked back at him, young, full of light, caught forever in a time that no longer existed. He didn't cry. He just stood there, letting the ache sit in his chest like an old friend returned. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of her footsteps as she limped back toward the couch. Neither of them said goodnight. They didn't have to. By the fourth morning, John woke to a smell he hadn't known in years. It was earthy, herbal, a hint of something toasted and wild, not the stale aroma of dry beans or the black bitterness of overboiled coffee. It tugged at something in his memory. A different time, a different kitchen, a woman humming softly while chopping onions. He followed the scent to the cabin's small hearth, where Elena stood balanced on one leg, stirring a pot with careful, practiced rhythm. A pouch of crushed herbs and desert roots sat beside her on the table. His tin cup, cleaned and filled, steamed nearby. He didn't say a word, just watched. She glanced at him once, only once, and then continued as if his presence was expected, even welcome. When she handed him the cup, her hands didn't tremble. He took it, nodded. The drink was hot, bitter, with a sweet, smoky finish that lingered like summer rain on dry ground. "What is it?" he asked after a sip. "Elk root, sage, wild honey." She paused. "For your cough." He hadn't realized he'd been coughing. Not out loud, not enough to notice, but she had. "You used to do this?" he asked. She shrugged. "My grandmother did. I watched, then learned. The old way." The old way. That stuck with them. They ate together in silence. Not across a table, just two bowls resting on opposite sides of the stove. Two people leaning against opposite counters. It wasn't domestic. It wasn't a routine, not yet, but it was something. That evening, John went to check the eastern fence line. It didn't need checking, he'd fixed it 3 weeks ago, but his feet carried him there anyway. When he returned, the cabin smelled of roasted cornmeal and mesquite. A small clay plate sat on the porch rail, still warm.
He picked it up, broke the flatbread in half, and stood under the dying sun, eating with his hands, feeling the dust settle on his shoulders like memory. Inside, she was mending something, one of his old shirts, probably. He didn't look too closely. The thread was darker than the fabric. He noticed the care in the stitching, not the color. They didn't talk much that day, or the next, but they moved around each other differently now. Not like strangers, like two ghosts learning how to share a house again. On the sixth night, the lantern flickered as the wind changed. It was cooler, sharper, coming down from the high pass to the north. John stood outside watching the dark line of the canyon. Elena stepped out beside him, wrapped in the same blanket she'd used since the day he carried her in. She didn't speak, just stood close enough for her shoulder to brush his for a moment before pulling away again. "Do you always eat alone?" she asked softly. John kept his eyes on the dark. "Used to, not so much now." She didn't reply, but he saw the corner of her mouth lift slightly, just once. Later, as the moon rose, John found himself adding more wood to the fire than usual. Not for warmth, for light. He placed the pot closer to the edge of the flame, let the herbs inside steep slower. He didn't rush the night anymore. And in that flickering quiet, something began to grow, not loud, not sudden, but steady. It was on the seventh morning that John found her sitting beneath the mesquite tree, same place he'd found her days ago. Her leg was stretched out in front of her, wrapped and steadied. Her hands were working something into the dirt, dry leaves, bits of crushed pod, small seeds she must have picked up while limping through the brush. He didn't interrupt, just leaned against the post near the barn, watching. She didn't notice him at first, or maybe she did and didn't care. There was a stillness to her now, something beyond weariness. Not peace, something older. The kind of stillness people carry when they've run long enough to know they'll never run far enough. "I used to live just south of the ridge," she said without looking up. Her voice was steady, stronger. John stepped forward, slow. "That right?" She nodded. "Navajo land. My village wasn't big, maybe 30, 40 people. Grandparents, cousins. We had goats, cornfields, children who knew more about plants than about towns." He listened, standing in the shade. "We weren't hiding," she added. "We were surviving." He said nothing. One day, 2 wagons came, men in gray coats. One wore a badge, said we were being relocated, said it was law, said they had papers. We asked for time, 1 day, to gather things, bury a woman who'd just passed. Her hand clenched the dirt. They said no, that wasn't part of the arrangement. John felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen this before. Different uniform, same words. "I ran that night," she said. "Took what I could. Not because I was brave, just because I was faster than the others." There was no pride in her voice, no drama, just fact. "They tried to stop you." She looked up at him then, eyes glinting. "They called us government property." The words hit like a slap. John's grip on the fence post hardened. She didn't continue, just sat back, resting her head against the trunk. "I didn't want to bring this here," she said quietly. "You didn't bring anything here," he replied. "They did." She gave him a long look, not grateful, not pleading, just acknowledging. "I don't know what they'll do," she said after a pause. "I don't know how long it'll take them to find me, but they will. They always do." John stared out toward the canyon's edge, where the ridgeline cut sharp against the morning sky. The air smelled different today, like iron and dust. A storm, maybe, or something worse. "You said you fought in the war," she said, voice gentle. "I did." "Did you ever stop fighting?" He didn't answer right away. Then, with a wry glance, said, "I thought I had." That evening, John made soup again. Same ingredients, same pot, but it tasted better. Maybe it was the fire. Maybe it was her sitting closer than usual. Maybe it was that, for the first time, he asked, "Want me to add more salt?" She nodded. Later, he brought out an old journal, leather-bound, worn from time and weather. He didn't open it, just set it on the table and left it there. Elena looked at it, but didn't touch. She didn't need to. She knew what it was. The only place a man like John had spoken his grief. He lit a candle that night, not because they needed light, but because she was reading. And somehow that made the whole cabin feel less like a tomb and more like a home. It was just after dawn when John noticed it. He was checking the north fence, the one that ran low and crooked along the dry gulch. The ground there was softer than most places on the ranch, fine powdered dust that clung to boots and remembered every step. That morning, it remembered some that weren't his. There, beside the fence post, were prints, heavy, sunk deep, different tread, not rancher boots, thicker, wider, clean edges, like the soles had been newer than anything John had worn in years. He knelt down, brushing lightly with his hand. The wind hadn't touched them yet. Too fresh. Maybe a few hours old, maybe less. He didn't curse, didn't stand quickly or draw his rifle. He just studied. The tracks ran from the east, followed the line of the fence for 10 or 12 paces, then veered off, back into the brush. Not random, purposeful. A scout, maybe, or someone who wanted to look like they were just passing through. John rose and looked out across the ridge. The canyon beyond stretched wide and endless, but he knew better than to believe in emptiness. People hid in open places all the time, and not all of them meant well. He returned to the cabin slower than usual, eyes sharper, senses tuned like a man waiting for a sound he couldn't quite name. Inside, Elena was boiling roots again. Her ankle had improved. She could walk now, even outside, if she leaned on the rail. She'd gathered more pods, more desert herbs, enough to fill 3 small jars she'd scrounged from his cellar. When she saw his face, she paused. "You saw something." Not a question. He set his rifle down beside the door, carefully, silently. "Boot prints," he said. Her eyes didn't change. No widening, no gasp, just a long breath, slow and heavy. How close? North fence. Were they following me? He looked at her, really looked. There was no panic in her expression, only something colder, familiar. A woman who'd lived with fear so long it became a part of her breath. "I don't know," he said.
"But I'm not assuming otherwise." She nodded, eyes drifting toward the window. Outside, the wind had picked up, brushing dust across the path like a veil. John moved quietly that afternoon. He cleaned the rifle on the porch, oiled the lever, counted rounds. Not in a hurry, not loud, just deliberate. The way a man builds a wall he hopes he'll never have to use. He checked the horses, tightened the gate latch, moved the kerosene from under the sink to a place beside the hearth. Routine things, necessary things. That night, he didn't sit in his chair. He stood by the door, lantern unlit, listening. Elena didn't speak, but she didn't sleep either. He could hear her stirring softly inside, the pages of a journal turning now and then. That same silence between them, it wasn't empty anymore. It was charged. Before midnight, he stepped out into the yard. The moon was thin. A silver sliver hung like a question above the canyon. He looked up and whispered, not to the stars, but to the dark beyond them, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" Psalm 27:1. It had been years since he'd prayed, but tonight wasn't about words. It was about where he stood and who he was willing to stand for. The wind shifted again that evening. It wasn't loud, just enough to carry the desert's chill early, curling through the gaps in the walls, nudging at the corners of windows and doors like a polite intruder. John built the fire higher, but not too much, didn't want to make her feel like he was overreacting. Elena didn't say much during supper,
She ate slowly, eyes distant, turning her spoon in the tin bowl even after the stew was gone. The firelight played shadows across her face, outlining the curve of her cheek, the hollow beneath her eyes. He didn't press. He never did. After the dishes were washed and the pot set aside to soak, she lingered near the hearth. Her fingers traced the edge of the mantel absently, stopping at the photograph John had righted just days before. She didn't ask about it. He didn't offer. Some stories, she understood, were told in silence. Outside, the night stretched deep and open, the sky blooming with stars so sharp they looked carved into the heavens. John stepped onto the porch, letting the air cool the warmth from the fire still clinging to his skin. He stood there for a while, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the canyon beyond. He heard the door open softly behind him. Then her steps. Elena came out wrapped in her blanket, arms tucked beneath the coarse wool. She didn't speak, just stepped beside him, close, but not too close. Not yet. They stood like that for a long while. The porch creaked beneath them, wood dry and weather-worn. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote barked once, then fell silent. The sound echoed across the land and disappeared into nothing. Elena tilted her face toward the sky. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how small the stars feel when you're running. But now, just standing here, they feel bigger again." John turned his head slightly. "You were alone a long time," he said. She nodded. "So was I." Silence again. But now it wasn't sharp or cold. It was full, settled, safe. She leaned against him, barely at first, just the edge of her shoulder grazing his. When he didn't move, she shifted a little more, letting the side of her head rest against his upper arm. John didn't speak. He just adjusted his stance slightly, so she wouldn't have to hold herself up. For a man who had carried loss like a second spine, the weight of her felt light, not in body, in spirit, like something whole had touched what had been hollow for too long. The stars turned quietly overhead. The night deepened. Eventually, she whispered, "You miss them." He didn't have to ask who. He simply nodded. She didn't offer comfort, no platitudes, no soft-spoken clichés. Instead, she said, "I used to think I'd never stop looking behind me." "And now?" "I don't know," she replied, "but this doesn't feel like running." The words hung between them. He turned to look at her, and she met his eyes. There was no fear in them now, just something deep and unreadable, like the desert itself. And for the first time in 12 long years, John McAllister didn't feel like the last man standing on earth. He felt accompanied. Together they stood beneath the stars, wrapped not in romance, but in recognition. No promises, no questions, just presence. And in that quiet, something in John's chest unlocked, a door long rusted shut by grief and time. Eleva didn't come outside the next morning. John noticed. Not in any grand way, just the way a man notices something missing from a rhythm he's grown used to. The porch chair beside his sat empty. No warm clay plate rested on the rail. No sound of her shuffling steps against the floorboards. He didn't ask, but he waited. After breakfast, he found her in the back of the cabin, seated by the single-pane window that overlooked the rear slope, where wild mint sometimes grew after summer rains. She wasn't looking out, though. She was staring at her hands, calloused, trembling slightly, clasped too tightly in her lap. "You okay?" he asked gently. She didn't answer at first. Then, without looking up, she said, "Maybe I should go." John leaned against the doorframe. "Go where?" "Anywhere." Her voice was steady but tired. "Far from here. Before they come. Before they bring whatever's still chasing me." He crossed his arms, frowning. "This is your home now." "It's not," she said, not unkindly. "It's yours."
The silence after that was heavy, not tense, not bitter, but full of truth neither of them wanted to hold. John stepped closer. "You think this place had life in it before you showed up?" he asked. "It was just walls and dust. I barely remembered how to speak before you started boiling sage in my kitchen." She looked at him then, eyes rimmed with something raw and old. "I didn't mean to take anything from you." "You didn't," he said. "You gave it back." She shook her head slightly. "They'll come, you know that." "I do. And you'll be in the way." John paused, then replied simply, "Good." She blinked, startled. "Why?" "Because I'd rather be in the way," he said, "than live another year just going through the motions." His voice was firm now, not loud, not angry, just clear. He reached into the drawer beside the stove and pulled out the small leather-bound Bible he hadn't opened in years. He set it gently on the table between them. "I've walked through fire," he said. "I've buried more than a man should. I thought God was done speaking to me. But then you showed up, half dead, with nothing but silence and stubbornness, and somehow this place started to breathe again." He flipped the book open to a passage he'd underlined long ago. "Let the spine crack, let the dust rise. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." 1 Corinthians 13:7. He looked at her, and for once she couldn't look away. "I'm not asking you to stay for me," he said. "I'm telling you this is yours now, too." She wiped at her cheek with the back of her hand. "I used to think the only way to survive was to be alone," she whispered. "Me too." He stepped closer, offered his hand, not to take, not to pull, just to offer. She took it. Not quickly, not out of impulse, but like a woman who had waited her whole life for someone to stand still long enough to reach her. Together, they stepped out onto the porch. The sky stretched wide and empty above them. The horizon flickered with heat, but something darker lingered far beyond it. They both knew what was coming, but for now, they stood side by side, ready. If you like this video, please comment number 1. If you don't like it, please comment number 2. The sound of hooves broke the morning stillness, measured, deliberate, too many to be harmless. John McAllister had been waiting for it. He stood on the porch of his cabin, rifle cradled in his arms, gaze locked on the desert trail where 4 riders now emerged from the rising dust. They rode in formation, like men used to taking what they wanted. Dust-colored coats hung heavy on their shoulders, wide-brimmed hats pulled low, shadows masking their eyes. One of them, a tall man with a jagged scar running from brow to cheek, dismounted first. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. "You McAllister?" the man asked. John didn't answer right away. He stepped down from the porch, slow and steady, boots crunching against the dry earth. He stopped at the fence line, a silent border that might as well have been drawn in blood. "I am." The man reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "Got a federal order here. States you're harboring a native woman, classified for relocation by authority of the Indian Affairs Commission. We're here to collect." John didn't so much as glance at the paper. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but steady. "There's no one here under your authority. This is my land." The scarred man's lip twitched into something between a smirk and a warning. "You think that changes the law?" "I think it changes who has the right to walk on it," John said, lifting the rifle ever so slightly. "Not aimed, but ready." One of the others chuckled. "Old man's got grit." Another rider's hand drifted toward his belt. John's eyes narrowed. This was the moment, the line in the sand. He had lived too many years in silence, watching the world spin without him. But today, the wind shifted. Today, he was part of the storm. "You got until I count to 3, the scarred man said. John didn't flinch. "One's enough." The next second cracked like thunder. A single shot rang out, kicking up dust inches from the scarred man's boot. The message was clear. Next one won't miss. Silence fell like a shroud over the desert. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The scarred man looked down at the bullet mark near his boot. Fresh, precise, deliberate. His eyes met John's across the space between them, and for a flicker of a second there was no bravado left, only the recognition of a man who meant every word. The other 3 shifted uneasily in their saddles, hands inching toward holsters, unsure whether to draw or wait. One of them, younger than the rest, glanced nervously at the horizon, as if calculating how fast a man could die out here before the sun reached its peak. John stood unmoved. The rifle in his grip didn't shake. He wasn't bluffing, and they knew it. "You sure you want to start this, old man?" the scarred leader asked, trying to inject steel into a voice that now trembled just slightly. "This ain't worth dying over." "I've already buried too much," John replied, his voice gravel and grit. "You come further, I bury more." There was no rage in him, just finality, the tone of someone who had nothing left to lose, except the one fragile thing he had found again. The scarred man shifted his weight. He wasn't used to this, used to folks backing down at the sight of a badge, a name, a gun. But McAllister didn't blink. Behind that lined face was something older than law, older than fear. It was resolve. The seconds dragged long and heavy. Sweat began to trickle beneath collars, and the heat of the sun pressed harder with each heartbeat. Still, no one moved. Then a voice broke the stillness. "John?" It was Elena. She stood at the threshold of the cabin, barefoot on the wooden floor, her presence delicate but unshaken. The wind caught strands of her black hair, blowing them across her face, but her eyes stayed locked on the men below. "Let me go with them," she said, quiet but firm. "If I leave, they won't hurt you." John turned his head only slightly, not lowering the rifle. His jaw clenched. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not now, not after everything. And yet, here it was. The true test. He didn't speak, couldn't, but something inside him twisted, cold and deep. The scarred man smirked. "Smart girl." "Smart girl," the scarred man repeated, spitting the words like dust from his tongue. Elena didn't flinch. She stepped further out, limping slightly, but steady. Her eyes never left the man's face, and her voice didn't waver. "I'll go," she said again, louder this time. "Leave him out of this." John lowered the rifle a hair, not in surrender, but in disbelief. "Elena," he said, the name a whisper torn from a wound. She turned to him. "They'll kill you, John. You know they will." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Then let them try." Her expression softened, eyes glistening now with more than sunlight. "Don't," she pleaded. "Please, I've run long enough." He took a step forward, placing himself between her and the riders once more. This time there was no rifle in hand, just the weight of his words. "You're not running again," he said. "Not for them, not for me." She reached for his arm, fingers trembling. "They'll hurt you." He took her hand in his. "Greater love has no one than this," he said softly, his eyes on hers, "than to lay down one's life for one's friends." Her breath caught. A verse not shouted, but spoken like a vow. Not to save her, but to stand with her. Elena's voice cracked. "I'm not worth that." "Yes, you are."
His words weren't heroic. They were honest, quiet, final, the kind that carved into bone. Behind them, the mercenaries began to stir. They weren't here for sentiment. The scarred man clicked his tongue, tapping the butt of his rifle against his thigh. "You think this changes anything?" he asked. John didn't answer. He simply turned back toward them, hands steady now, Elena beside him. She didn't step behind. She stayed next to him.
The scarred man cursed under his breath. Damn fools. But even he, for all his swagger and violence, saw it now. This wasn't just some cowboy defending a stranger. This was something else entirely, something unshakable. Love, maybe, or defiance, or both. And the desert, ancient and indifferent, watched without judgment. The scarred man stared at John for a long, burning moment. There was no bluff in the old cowboy's stance, no bravado, just a quiet stillness that unsettled even seasoned killers. His hand hovered near the rifle again, not in panic, but with the kind of practiced calm that came from years of living close to death. The other 3 mercenaries exchanged looks. One scratched his beard, another shifted in the saddle, uncomfortable under the weight of something they hadn't counted on: conviction. This wasn't a rescue mission gone wrong. This was something else. A man who'd drawn his line in the dust and meant it. "You really gonna die for this?" the scarred man asked, quieter now. John's eyes didn't waver. "If I must." "You don't even know her story." "I know enough." The scarred man scoffed, but it lacked venom. "She's just another lost one."
"You don't have to be the martyr here." "I'm not dying for guilt," John said. "I'm standing for grace." He stepped forward once more, slow and deliberate, boots crunching the dry gravel beneath. His voice carried, not loud, but weighty. "You think I don't know how the world works? I've watched it chew up good men, bury them in shallow graves, and call it justice. But not here. Not today." A beat of silence. "She brought something back to this place," he added, his voice lowering. "Something I thought I'd buried with my family, and I won't let you take that." For a moment, no one moved. The wind sighed through the canyon like the breath of something ancient and tired of blood. The youngest of the 4 mercenaries looked down, visibly shaken. "This ain't what we signed up for," he muttered. Another nodded, hesitating. "We ain't lawmen, we're hired hands." The scarred man looked at them with growing irritation, but he saw it too. Saw the shift in their eyes, the cost, the risk, the emptiness of fighting a man who had nothing left to fear. John McAllister stood tall, weathered, worn, but unwavering. The kind of man the desert shaped but never broke. And behind him, Elena watched, not hiding, not afraid. For a long moment, no one dared speak. The sun hovered at its cruelest, casting harsh shadows that split the earth. Yet it was not the heat that held them still. It was the presence of something unspoken, a resolve older than the mountains. John stood like an oak, rooted in pain, hardened by loss, and now awakened by love. Every wrinkle on his face had seen death, but today he chose to stand for life. Elena took a step forward, just one, and the creak of the wooden porch beneath her bare foot was louder than thunder in that stillness. She walked until she was beside him. The wind tousled her hair, and her cheeks still bore the stain of tears, but her hands were steady now. Without a word, she reached out and took John's hand. It wasn't dramatic. There were no declarations, no swelling music. But in that one gesture, rough fingers threading with calloused ones, everything changed. John looked down at her, not surprised, not shocked, but moved. Moved in the way only a man could be who thought the best of his life had ended a long time ago.
"I'm not running anymore," she said quietly, eyes on the riders. "Not from them. Not from what I believe. Not from what I've found here." The scarred man exhaled sharply, like a man realizing the job he took wasn't the job he wanted. "We've seen enough," said one of the mercenaries behind him. "We ain't gonna shoot a woman standing by her man." The youngest nodded. "They're not fugitives. They're just folks trying to live." The scarred man looked at them, then back at John. His lip curled, but his eyes betrayed something else, respect, or maybe just weariness. "You're lucky we ain't the kind to push our luck," he muttered. John said nothing. His hand never left Elena's. The scarred man tipped his hat once, not in submission, not in defeat, but as a recognition between men who faced hell and walked out different. And slowly he turned his horse. One by one, the others followed. And just like that, the sound of hooves echoed away into the canyon. The threat had passed, but neither John nor Elena moved, because in that stillness something had been decided, not just survival, but belonging. The riders disappeared beyond the ridge, swallowed by the desert. No words were spoken. No final threats. Only the stillness remained. John stood motionless on the porch, rifle still at his side, though his hands had stopped trembling. His breath came slowly, like a man learning to breathe again after years underwater. Beside him, Elena remained quiet. She hadn't moved since the moment the men rode away. Her hand still in his, her eyes fixed on the horizon. But there was no fear in them now, just a deep, worn-out stillness. Then, softly, she turned and looked at him. Her lips parted, but no words came. She didn't need to speak. Instead, she gently sat down on the top step of the porch. John followed. He laid the rifle down beside him, not out of carelessness, but with finality, like it had done its part, and now its weight could rest. Elena wrapped the old blanket tighter around her shoulders. The wind was cooler now, brushing across the porch like a gentle breath. The sun had dropped low, casting long shadows from the rocks and fencing. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked, her voice barely above the wind. John shook his head. "Not today." She nodded. Silence again. But it wasn't heavy. It wasn't the silence John had known for years, the silence of grief, of loss, of everything that had once made him a man. This silence was full of things not yet spoken, of things that didn't need to be. She leaned against him, just slightly. Her head rested near his shoulder. He didn't move away. For a long time they sat like that. The world didn't change, but something in it had shifted. A coyote howled in the far canyon, distant, harmless. The stars began to peek out, one by one. John let his gaze drift upward. He hadn't watched the stars in years, but tonight they felt familiar again. Not lonely, just there. He turned to look at Elena. She had fallen asleep, or maybe just closed her eyes to listen to the wind. His hand rested on hers again, still and quiet. And for the first time since the fire took everything, John McAllister didn't feel alone. Not in his home, not in his heart, not in this life. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The days didn't rush. They arrived softly, like fog rolling over canyon ridges. Quiet, steady, unannounced. Elena stayed. There was no declaration, no grand decision. Just a morning when she rose before dawn and began sowing rows of herbs behind the cabin, her hands pressing the soil like she belonged to it.
From that day forward, she never left. John never asked her to stay, but he never asked her to leave either. Instead, he showed her how to mend the fence line, how to use the old lever-action rifle, how to train the younger mare. She showed him how to steep wild mint into calming tea, how to read stars for weather signs, and how to laugh, brief, breathless laughs that always surprised him more than her. She planted sage near the porch, lavender by the well, basil in clay pots that lined the cabin window. The scent of her presence began to replace the smell of dust and dry wood. And in return, she filled his cup every morning, before he even reached for the pot. They settled into rhythm, not routine. Because routine is what you do to survive, rhythm is what you do to live. The townsfolk noticed. At first there were only whispers. A Navajo woman living alone with a man like John McAllister? Some said she was a healer. Others called her something worse. But none dared to confront him. Because John had changed, but not enough to make people forget who he had once been. He rode into town only when necessary: supplies, mail, a new blade for the scythe. Elena never came with him. He never asked her to, and she never needed to. Back at the cabin, the seasons moved. Spring found them harvesting small bundles of herbs. Summer brought thunderstorms that rattled the roof, but not their hearts. Autumn turned the canyon into a painting, and John taught Elena how to track deer. She never aimed to kill, just watched, learned, remembered. They built things together. A drying shed for her herbs, a coop for chickens they didn't yet own, a new gate which creaked every morning like it had been there forever. John fixed the roof one afternoon and found in the eaves a rusted horseshoe nailed upside down, left by someone long gone. He turned it right side up, smiled, and didn't say why. Elena noticed, of course. She noticed everything. She still didn't speak of what came before, where she had fled from, what they had taken from her. But some nights she sang, in a language John didn't know. Soft, mournful lullabies that floated through the canyon and into his bones. He didn't ask for a translation. He just listened. And when he rose in the middle of the night to check the fence or tend the fire, she was often already awake, wrapped in a blanket on the porch, watching the stars. Sometimes she spoke without turning. "They say the stars are our ancestors," she said once, "that they watch until we learn what they already know." John didn't answer. He just sat beside her, let the silence speak. The scar across his past had not vanished, but it no longer bled. And in the steadiness of those small shared days, he felt something he hadn't in decades. Not happiness, not even comfort, but meaning. A reason to wake before dawn. A hand that passed him the tea before he reached for it. They still didn't call it anything. Not love, not healing. Just life, hard-earned, quiet and real. Night draped itself over the canyon like a velvet cloak, and the world seemed to breathe at a slower pace. The sky was thick with stars, each flickering pinprick a long-gone light calling back to something ancestral. John and Elena sat together on the porch, only the soft glow of a kerosene lamp holding back the dark. Elena adjusted the blanket around them, her fingers brushing against John's. It was the same blanket she'd carried on that first night, but now it felt sacred, woven with safety. She cleared her throat softly. "John, can I ask you something?" He nodded, listening. She drew a breath, steady. "If you could go back, if you could change what happened, would you?" The question hung between them like a suspended breath. John's hand tightened around the cup of tea, warmed by her lavender mint infusion. The steam curled upward like smoke from another life. He looked out at the desert, the horizon still glowing faintly. Finally, he turned toward her. "I thought about it," he said, voice hushed. "More than once. But what I lost, it led me here, to you." She swallowed, unsure for a moment. He held her gaze. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him." Behind him, the night seemed to deepen, as though listening. Elena closed her eyes, leaning closer. "That verse, you believe it?" He lifted one eyebrow, half amused, half grateful. "Not just believe, I've lived it." Another long silence settled. For weeping, or thinking, or healing, John didn't know which.
Then Elena spoke, quietly but with conviction. "We built something here," she said. "Not perfect, maybe not what either of us expected, but it's real." He pressed his fingers to the back of her hand. "Real is enough." The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of basil and sage from her garden. Somewhere in the distance, night birds called, and the stars leaned closer. John stood slowly, offering her his hand. "Come with me." She smiled, not a flash of triumph, but something softer that came from a place deeper than words. She placed her hand in his, and he helped her to her feet. He led her to the edge of the porch where the moonlight spilled across dry grass and desert stone. They walked together without speaking, steps in rhythm, unhurried, deliberate. He stopped before the rise of the canyon's rim where the world stretched endless. They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, looking into the vast emptiness that once swallowed hope. Now it felt full of possibilities. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder. He rested his cheek on her hair. No need for words, their silence spoke volumes. The night was cool, the desert air sharp against their skin. But inside they felt warmth that didn't come from fire. He spoke at last, voice soft. "Out there, in a land thought to be barren," he said, "love had bloomed, quiet, defiant, and true, and it needed no name." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. As they moved back toward the cabin, the first breeze of dawn kissed the sky, pink and pale, promising. In the years to come, the townsfolk would whisper stories. A desert healer and a lone cowboy working the land. Some called it legend. Others called it a miracle. John didn't promise her forever. He simply squeezed her hand once and looked forward. The future was quiet, open, wide enough for both grief and gratitude. And in that moment they both knew they were home. For those of you watching, maybe you too have known silence like John's. A silence that comes after loss, after war, after years of holding on without knowing what for. Maybe you've stood at the edge of your own canyon, asking if there's still something worth hoping for. This story, like so many true Wild West stories, isn't just about the land or the gun or the grit. It's about hearts that keep beating, even after they're broken. It's about finding light again in the most unlikely of places, through kindness, courage, and quiet companionship. And perhaps, like John, you found that grace doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it walks up the porch steps with a limp, carrying herbs and silence. If this story touched something in you, an old memory, a long-lost hope, or simply a moment of peace, we invite you to stay with us. There are more stories to come, stories of the land, of love, of faith, and of people who refuse to be forgotten. Subscribe to our channel, share this moment with someone who needs it, and come walk with us again into the true Wild West.